Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to talk to you here about neural correlates of consciousness, an updated account, integrating clinical findings and neuroimaging studies. So to kind of make this concrete, and show the clinical implication of these accounts, I wanted to give you an example starting from disorders of consciousness patients. So there is a lot of discussion recently in the literature about the meaning of these purposeful behaviors that define the minimally conscious state. So patients in minimally conscious state are unable to communicate, but they show some non-reflexive behaviors. Most of them are actually quite simple and so difficult to interpret. Some of them respond to command, but a lot of them only show fixation to stimulus or visual pursuit. But because they can communicate with us, it's actually quite difficult to interpret sometimes alone. And so that's where the neuroscience of consciousness can come at the rescue and help us to decipher the meaning of these behaviors, and also like the likelihood for these patients to be conscious. In particular, over the last few years, there has been one major progress in consciousness science, which is the development of a consciousness index, the perturbational complexity index, or PCI, which is derived from transcranial magnetic stimulation combined with EEG. And basically, you stimulate the brain and you look at how the brain responds. And if the patients are conscious, like say here in wakefulness or say REM sleep, so even if the patients are unresponsive, they would actually have a complex response and a high complexity index. And if they are unconscious, like here in non-REM sleep, an example here of the different traces at different time courses of different areas, you'll see that if the patients are unconscious, the response is very stereotypical and very simple. And so that PCI, perturbational complexity index, has been validated on subjects that can respond. And then we can use it to extrapolate the likelihood of someone that cannot communicate to be conscious. And so that's really an important point, that you want to validate these measures and calibrate them in a population that is able to report, subjects that are able to report if they were like conscious or not during sleep or anesthesia, and then actually use it to infer consciousness in patients that are unable to communicate. So you really need a separate validation for these measures. And that's what has been done by Marcello Massimini, Silvia Cazzarotto, and colleagues. And, we could see in these studies that, if you're unconscious, like here in blue, the maximum perturbational complexity index in each one's brain is going to be really low compared to in conditions where you have unresponsive consciousness, like in REM sleep or ketamine anesthesia, wakefulness, and importantly, in brain damaged patients that are conscious. In all these cases, the maximum PCI in each brain was actually really much higher, to the point that we could draw a line of PCI 0.31 that could separate with 100% specificity and sensitivity who was conscious or not in this validation cohort. Yeah, and so we have then a good tool to apply this measure, to patients with disorders of consciousness and see what happens in minimally conscious state patients. MCS plus being the ones who can, have a response to command, and minimally conscious minus are the ones that do not. And if you apply this measure, validated measure in this patient population, what you see is most of the patients in a minimally conscious state, actually 95% of them, are diagnosed to be conscious, compared to 81% of patients here on the right with unresponsive wakefulness syndrome or vegetative state patient. So if we look at these results, there's a striking dissociation. Yeah, most patients, even if they have very simple behaviors with minimally conscious state, are diagnosed as conscious, unlike most patients in vegetative state. So it looks from this data that actually purposeful behavior and consciousness are tightly linked. And that's what TMS EEG tell you. That's the best tool we have available. But how does it fit then with the rest of the science of consciousness? There has been a lot of debate, again, in the last few years about the role of consciousness for behavior. Some researchers state that consciousness is an epiphenomenon and you can do so many things unconsciously. Well, actually, again, it depends on the methods you use. there has been some great progress in the sense of consciousness in the last few years with development of new skills like the perceptual awareness scale, especially this scale, because this has been directly validated as a scale by subjective reports by the subjects to actually accurately correspond to gradations in one experience. So this scale, the important part of it is that it's not dichotomous, it's not all or none. The subjects with different experiments came to the 3 to 4 point scale, where you had no experience at all. I had no idea that a stimulus like a square, for example, was presenting on screen. A brief glimpse, and I didn't really know what I saw, but I saw something, and then almost clear or clear image. This graded scale is actually validated by the subjects to accurately correspond to what they feel. And if you use that scale, if you actually had no idea that a stimulus is presented on the screen, actually there's no unconscious processing you can find. Accuracy is at chance. It's true in normal subjects, but also in patients with blind sight. So blind sight has been considered as one of the key conditions to suggest that there is so much unconscious behavior going on. Well, it depends how you ask. If you have here on the top binary question seen versus not seen for a stimulus in the blind field or intact field, you find some correct responses when the patients say they don't see it. But if you use that graded scale, so not seen at all in the perceptual awareness scale, will actually show again a change performance. So blind sign disappears. So the devil is in the details. But if you actually use skills that accurately capture subjective experience, indeed, like in many conscious states, patients in disorders of consciousness, it looks like consciousness and purposeful behavior go hand in hand. Another, interesting point when we compare these patients with disorders of consciousness together is like there is a marked difference in brain function between patients in minimal conscious state and patients in vegetative state. And because CMS EG tells us that these patients, are fully responsive, but there's a big difference in consciousness between them, we can actually also try to look at group level analysis for differences in brain function that can tell us about consciousness. So the group level difference is also informative for the neural correlates of consciousness, or NCC. What do you find if you compare minimally conscious state patients and vegetative state patients, where there has been a number of studies about it, but the main kind of consistent finding is the areas that best differentiate these two populations when you look at the single subject level are actually primary and like high order, but like sensory specialized cortices. So you find that areas like visual, somatomotor, auditory cortices, and like here in fMRI resting state, but also here in PET, visual cortex, are actually the best bet to differentiate these patients in terms of their consciousness, so minimally conscious patients versus vegetative state. So again, how does it fit with the literature on consciousness? There has been a lot of support from a range of the various studies to say that it's not the primary sensory cortices, it's not the sensory specialized cortices that matter, but more the frontal parietal areas. But the problem in these studies is they were actually conflating consciousness with responsive, with behavior. If you look at lesion studies per se, we argued in some recent papers reviewing lesion studies, and this is one example, that there's actually much more evidence for posterior cortical lesions to be damaging for consciousness and its recovery than frontal cortex. And here is a most recent studies in neurology looking at anoxic brain injury. And you can see here on the right side that if you look at anoxic damage to the occipital cortex alone, it's actually more predictive of recovery of consciousness than using the whole brain. So there seems to be, as the author suggests, that the integrity of posterior cortical areas is especially important for consciousness. Now, these data, lesion data, fit with our previous result during sleep, where again we separated consciousness from responsiveness. We look within sleep, when you're unresponsive anyway, but if you're having an experience or not. So CE here is awakening with conscious experience versus NCE, which is when you're unconscious. And both during non-REM sleep and REM sleep, when you discard compounds due to changes in behavior, you actually find that the areas predictive for being conscious versus not are actually mostly posterior, occipital, parietal, and temporal areas. This is also what we recently confirmed using intracranial recordings. We have this recent study and with awakenings from sleep in patients in the epilepsy monitoring units. And you can see overall in the whole brain, yes, there is a difference. There's more delta power or slow wave activity when you're unconscious compared to when you're conscious. But actually, if you look where it is in the brain, in prefrontal cortex, so beyond premotor, the anterior third of the frontal cortex, there is no significant difference between consciousness and unconsciousness. But you find these differences more in the posterior brain, like here, for example, in posterior temporal cortex. So this suggests, as we had seen during sleep, that indeed the posterior cortex is most predictive for consciousness. We also have a new data set during seizures suggesting the same findings. There are some seizures. In a quarter of seizures, actually, patients can be unresponsive, but still report that they remember that they were conscious during the seizures. If you look at these seizures here in blue, where patients are conscious but unresponsive, you will find that during these states, there's increased wave activity in prefrontal cortex, but actually not in parietal cortex. And when patients become unconscious, there is actually still high slow wave activity in the prefrontal cortex, but then you also find that posterior cortex is impaired. So in summary, loss of consciousness is actually best tracked by the activity in posterior cortex, while unresponsiveness is best tracked by frontal cortex. So all these data together suggest that if you dissociate consciousness versus responsiveness in neuroimaging, and if you also look at lesion studies, we reviewed this, recently in 2017 too, with other studies. Like it seems that if you actually, use these more careful approaches in neuroimaging, you find that the areas that are most predictive for consciousness are in posterior cortex. What about the NCC for content? Well, again, there's a bunch of studies that have been going on, but I'll show you like two types that are, to me, particularly interesting. So there is a recent review of, more than 90 patient cases by Fox and Parvizi in Nature Human Behavior, showing that there is actually an asymmetry. Not every area is most involved in consciousness. So these are actually, areas that are in red here on the bottom, the areas where you find more changes in conscious content, and in dark, the areas where you see less of them. And what you can see here is, again, there's a gradient, and a lot of these posterior cortical areas, especially sensory areas, if you stimulate them, they actually contribute a lot to consciousness, while you have a lot of these silent areas in the prefrontal cortex. So these causal studies with direct electrical stimulation suggest that there is indeed an asymmetry, and prefrontal cortex is less involved in consciousness and conscious contents than the back and also sensory cortices. And then interestingly, also in the last 2-3 years, there have been new paradigms that also try to approach the neurocorrelates of consciousness differently. And they're actually looking at what can account for stimuli that you perceive for a longer time. So stimuli, and especially intracranial electrode studies, because you can look at high frequency activity, proxy for neuronal firing in the gamma range, and you can actually have the temporal resolution to look at what's going on over time. And so like on the top here, there's a study by Leon Uhl and Gil Vishny, and showing that if you look at posterior cortex or ventrotemporal areas, for example, versus prefrontal cortex, you find that areas in the ventrotemporal cortex are actually more accurately tracking stimulus duration for stimuli that you attend. So if you have a stimulus of 1 second and a half, the activity in these regions will actually track how long you perceive them, and it is not the case in prefrontal areas. And then 2 other studies by Rafi Malak and colleagues here in the bottom left, showing that not only the pattern stability, is different and better tracked in these posterior cortical areas, but even more the representational similarity, the representational dissimilarity of the patterns and the relational coding. So these kind of more subtle analysis of how across different stimuli the pattern stays, a constant over time is actually really pointing to posterior cortical areas to being important to also sustaining the contents of consciousness. Similar analysis here with Lucia Meloni, Oscar Ferenczi, and al., where looking at representational similarity in posterior versus prefrontal areas, you see that there is much more, reliably tracking of these long-lasting stimuli of the content in posterior areas for different aspects, like, for example, faces versus object categories or object identity. So overall, if you look at the evidence, that I reviewed, and there are, again, like many other studies, just to show you a snapshot of it, it looks like there's a contrast, between posterior areas, especially in these new studies that discard compounds and look at more, various patterns to dissect really consciousness from consequences and from stimulus onset responses, that these posterior cortical areas are not only important to be conscious, but also important in specifying different conscious contents. And so the study, the picture that we kind of propose is like this, that it seems to be that there's a posterior hot zone in the back of the brain that is especially important for consciousness, with different parts of it. So being conscious, it's important for being conscious, but also for the contents of consciousness. And so different parts of it actually can specify different contents, like low-level contents in visual areas, for example, sensory areas, and higher level invariants in higher order areas. And then there are some other parts of the brain, especially in prefrontal cortex, that have a different kind of architecture and seem to be important for responsiveness and for consequences like attention or working memory or report, but seem to be less important for consciousness per se. And that's really important, to also for clinical care, for inferring the likelihood of patients with disorders of consciousness to actually have covert cognition and be able to recover. And so that's why I wanted to kind of link the two topics in this introduction talk to the rest of the session. And so if I had to conclude, TMS-EEG, the perturbational complexity index, is a real progress because it is the most accurate validated marker available to infer covert consciousness in patients. And importantly, it suggests that 95% of minimally conscious patients are conscious. So in these patients, the presence of purposeful behavior and consciousness is intimately linked. This result fits with new findings using the perceptual awareness scale that is validated by subjective reports to actually accurately track difference in experience. And that scale also, if you use it, you find a close association between consciousness of the stimuli and above tense performance. So you actually don't find anymore this unconscious processing that was prevalent when most researchers were using seen versus unseen scales, for example. Lesion studies, I showed here anoxia, but there are many others, suggest that one can be conscious without a prefrontal cortex, but that the integrity of posterior cortex is most predictive for consciousness and its recovery. And I also mentioned to you some stimulation studies for conscious content recording studies, of neuroimaging and also EEG, intracranial recordings, suggesting that the neural course of consciousness, for different kind of conscious content, but also now like for this kind of duration of the experience, are most consistently found in posterior brain areas, including sensory cortices. And so this is true for both conscious states. I mentioned like the sleep and seizures, and then MCS versus VS, and a large number of conscious contents. And so importantly, far from being invalidated by current consciousness science, the clinical assessment of patients with disorder of consciousness using behavior, using coma recovery scale for purposeful behaviors, is actually closely matching updated evidence about consciousness science in general. And what we need to do is further look at these different kinds of behaviors in the coma recovery scale and other scales to see which particular behavior are actually, most closely associated with these markers like TMS-EEG, PCI, or also these coma recovery scale items, which ones actually do require consciousness. Some of them are all, in neurotypical subjects. So there is an agenda here to try to integrate better disorders of consciousness science and consciousness science in general, and trying to understand the big picture so we can not only better diagnose patients, but develop new therapies for them. Thank you very much. So obviously this is a big teamwork, and my team in Madison, Wisconsin, Stephen Lawrence and Andrew Owen, and Carl Blumenfeld are, and then Carl Fiston as well. These are like great mentors of mine, and thank you very much for your attention.